Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great start to this week. I'd like to discuss The Condition of Secrecy by Inger Christensen, an amazing collection of essays from Christensen, who is a Danish poet and essayist. And the essays span 30 years, the 1960s to the 1990s, exploring and really revealing the ways in which Christensen was reflecting on ideas around poetry, art, human memory, consciousness, and the ways in which all of these are related to each other through human experience and language. Specifically language as an expression of human experience, but also language as an expression of life, and not just human life, but all life on Earth. And it really is this astonishing collection, getting to travel, across 3 decades with a mind that is continually grappling with these ideas in incredibly fluid writing with very incisive and insightful metaphors that work to an astonishing degree. The translation by Susanne Nied, it just reveals what a fluid writer Christensen could be. And so I just want to give some examples of that because I really highly recommend this collection. So in To Talk, to See, to Do, Christensen begins, "There are very few things worth talking about, and we don't talk about them. We can't talk about them. For instance, life, death, and love. We give them big, expensive names, something like a dress so good that we're not comfortable wearing it. We're shy, we're afraid, so we don't mention it. That kind of word is left hanging in the closet while we use all the nice, ordinary, and undeniably practical words in our daily dealings with each other. We're afraid, but we manage. We're afraid to be alone and afraid to be with others, afraid of what's finished, at a standstill, too orderly, and afraid of what's unfinished, messy and disorderly, and we're afraid of sex, afraid of death, but we manage. Or do we? Could it be that the reason we're still having wars is that we're afraid to tell each other that we're afraid of each other, and of everything else? To me, it's as if we keep going out in the rain and keep refusing to invent raincoats and galoshes." And she goes on, "Through this writing, I've been trying to get to the heart of my relationship with my readers. I want them to talk about what they don't talk about. What we talk to ourselves about anyway, deep inside." And there's just so many different ways. She goes, "Many people tell themselves that poetry is certainly one thing that has to tell the truth, or at least to tell some truths. But poetry is not truth. It's not even the dream of truth. Poetry is passion. It's a game, maybe a tragic game, one that we play with a world that plays its own game with us." And she engages in thought problems. I think that was a good example of the ways in which she engages in metaphors and analogies that really do work and allow her to explore the ideas she has and to communicate them to the reader. But she also engages in these really fascinating thought problems. For example, saying, okay, I have a die that with 6 sides and I'm going to roll it and it's going to land on a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And so there's a guarantee of some result. And this idea of, rolling the die in this deterministic sense of life that a lot of, individuals and philosophers had adopted throughout the 20th century and middle of the 20th century. And Christensen goes, well, what I like to think sometimes is that the die just keeps rolling. She describes it as having, I amuse myself by imagining the certainty that the die would never stop. Not on 1, or 6, or 2, or 5, or 3, or 4. I imagine it eternally rolling those opposing numbers around their impossible conjunction, deep within the center of the die, a 3-dimensional 7 in perpetual flux. And this idea of saying, I don't want things to be random. I want to, push against them. We get comments on art and the idea of language within art. Baroque refers to the period from 1600 to 1700, or in all time periods, to a thing that doesn't reveal its overarching similarities until it has overwhelmed us with differences. In Portuguese, il barroco means an irregular pearl, and the Baroque is just such an irregular pearl, a magnificent, odd, preposterous, downright tasteless, distorted pearl. Not at all perfect, but perfectly different. Or rather, it's not satisfied with being perfect. It also wants to reveal perfection as an irregularity in the way people create their concepts of the world. And so there is these ways in which she's just playing with, preconceived ideas that we as readers have, or that people who regard themselves as cultured and really reflective might have, and she wants to challenge those and interrogate those ideas. And it's very clear that she's been interrogating these ideas as a writer, as a human, as a thinker. She talks about, if we call things by their true names, that doesn't mean that the names are being used to represent things, and it doesn't mean that language mimics reality as a thing that is separate from language. Rather, a kind of threshold condition arises, where language and the world express themselves with the help of each other. The world, with its natural extension in language, comes to a consciousness of itself, and language, with its background in the world, becomes a world in itself, one steadily unfolding further. That's why it can be said that by writing poetry, we're trying to produce something that we ourselves are already a product of. And she then relates it to this idea of the silk from a silkworm and the concept of the Mobius strip that always repeats itself. If you've ever made them with this strand of paper and you fold it and then attach it together or tape it together, and you can just draw this infinite line on it. And so she's constantly exploring these ideas. And I think those are ideas that many writers have tried to explore, either through their stories or within lectures or essays. But I found that the way Christensen explores those is just so delightful. She goes at big ideas without necessarily using big, fancy technical words, and just probing very carefully and very thoughtfully. And so I really, really enjoyed the book. I highly recommend reading it. I want to share one more that's a slightly longer passage, and then mention a couple of other writers I was reminded of. Reality, from which surrealism arises and monitors its own foundation, does not disappear. When a daylight sky arches over an earthly home-style night, it may well clash a little with our senses, with the view we've come to consider the only one. But at night, between midnight and 2 a.m., when we close our eyes, we know perfectly well how natural it is for day to be right there with us. We know perfectly well how familiarly we move through the day, but at night the day moves just as familiarly through us. At night, when we settle down so confidently in the shadow of the earth, we're confident only because we know it's the light on the other side of the earth that gives us our familiar place in the shadow. Light and shadow inextricably bound in our form of night, in which we rest within what never rests. Basically, we live in a kind of simultaneity of day and night. A simultaneity or a poetry that teaches us that we are immortal only as long as we're alive. Of course, our nightly sleep in the shelter of the earth's shadow can be seen as practice for approaching absolute night. And so it's said that we waken from sleep at the moment when we dream that we're dreaming. And so there's just so many ways in which Christensen is just a wonderful person to think with as we're reading The Condition of Secrecy. She has one essay in particular where she examines every part of speech and sort of plays with nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs and prepositions, and just kind of exploring what does each bring to language. Could you imagine a language that only had those? Has there ever been a language that only had those? And just sort of playing with that and examining how that would reflect experience. And so it really is a book that is very fun to read, while also, as I said, having a lot of, there's quite substantial ideas presented in it. And so it's excellent. Please read this. Works that I was thinking of as I was reading it. One was, in part because I was just reading it recently, would have been Haruki Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, where he's again examining consciousness and memory. Not so much language, but I felt reading them sort of back to back as I was reading the essays, one or two a night. It felt like it made this book more enjoyable, because it felt like there was this little like competition going on between the two writers and their explorations. Another writer who I think tried and failed, but tried to get at that idea of memory and consciousness would have been Harold Brodkey, specifically the later stories that are published in Stories in an Almost Classical Mode, where he's in a sense rewriting the same approximately four experiences of his life. And you can trace how he writes them in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s, and how he's rewriting the same story, the same handful of stories over and over and over, and trying to like cut a little bit deeper into his memory. Can he find something else there that adds or makes a deeper three-dimensional aspect to the story and to the experience? And so that was another writer who came to mind. As I said, though, Christensen is just such a fluid writer that her essays are enjoyable despite what they're trying to explore, the intense ideas they're exploring. two other essay collections I've read this year that I really enjoyed. One was Shadow and Act by Ralph Ellison. This was much more autobiographical, but again, you have a top-notch writer really examining ideas and experience in this volume. And then, of course, Umberto echoes the infinity of lists, where he's consistently, again, meditating on connections between language and art, and specifically the concept of infinity and the ways in which lists reveal that and that human conception. And then with all of those beautiful ideas around shadow, around light, and language, I've thought of Ursula K. Le Guin, both Rokanan's World, but also more recently The Left Hand of Darkness. So I can highly recommend The Condition of Secrecy by Christensen. Please let me know if you've read it. I'm looking forward to trying to get a copy of one of her poetry collections now and reading that as well, either Alphabet or perhaps It. But yeah, let me know. And I was reading this as part of the Reading Euro 2021 challenge that Mark at Book Time with Elvis has organized. So I drew Denmark, and Elizabeth from the Bookish North recommended this writer to me, and specifically this volume. And what a great recommendation. So as always, let me know, and I hope you're having a great and safe week. Thanks.